As discussed earlier, transpiration is what drives cohesion tension, or in other words, what drives water uptake in plants. And we tend to think of water uptake as being a positive thing for plants, and it generally is. However, if it's excessive, the plant can dry out the soil prematurely. And so the plant needs some ability to regulate the rate at which water is moving through it. And that all starts with the guard cells. Recall that the guard cells are pairs of cells. There's this one guard cell, and here is another guard cell. Okay. And they're pairs of cells that guard the stomata, or the stoma pores of the leaves. And these guard cells operate by shrinking or swelling, or in other words, adjusting their turgor, adjusting the amount of water in their interior. If you look at the structure of a guard cell, I'm going to draw one guard cell here. They have thin outer cell walls, but in the interior middle facing parts of the cell wall is much more thick. When they are not fully turgid, the stoma is closed. However, if water moves into these cells, what you end up with is a cell, because of this thick interior portion, you end up with a guard cell that bends because that thickened inner cell wall resists stretching, whereas the outer cell wall stretches a bit. And so when you get two of them side by side and they both swell full of water, we now have an open stoma. It's a little counterintuitive in that if you got punched in the eye, let's say, that it would swell your eye shut. Well, it's the opposite here with the guard cells. When the cells become fully turgid or swell, they actually curve and open the stoma. So what causes them to swell or fill up with water? Well, that's where the essential nutrient potassium comes into play. Potassium is very soluble in water in the ionic form of K+. That just means potassium ion, and K is the elemental symbol for potassium. So K equals potassium. These guard cells, when flaccid, let's say, like this, they have a certain amount of potassium in them, but no more or less, relatively speaking, to the surrounding epidermal cells. And so when the plant needs to, I'm going to draw a couple of epidermal cells here. Here's one right here, synonymous with this lower one here. When the plant senses that it needs to open, it will actively pump potassium ions into the guard cells. And so when this happens, it has the effect of, when we were talking about osmosis, when we had our beaker with our membrane in between it and we added salt to one side, okay? If we add potassium to this side, well, then the water is going to move in that direction. And so when the potassium increases in the guard cells, water rapidly moves in from the surrounding cells. The water is going to follow the salts. And so for them to open, the potassium, if it becomes high, the water moves into them, they swell, and the stoma opens. And that is the main role in plants for potassium. Potassium is one of the big three essential nutrients in terms of applying them as fertilizers, and this is the main reason why we apply potassium as a fertilizer, because it allows a plant to regulate water use. So this gives a plant some control, but this is the only means of controlling it that the plant has full control over, let's say. There are a number of other factors that contribute to the rate at which water moves through a plant that the plant doesn't necessarily have any control over. And so let's make a list. Factors affecting transpiration rates. Go back to yellow. First on the list is light, for a couple of reasons. Photosynthesis occurs in the presence of light. It is light during daylight hours, and this is when plants need the most nutrients, when they need the most water. It also tends to be higher temperatures during the day, and so water evaporates during the day at rates much greater than it does at night. So all those reasons add up to the fact that the greater the light, or the higher the light, equals the greater the transpiration rate. Next on the list is temperature. The greater the temperature, the greater the transpiration rate, simply due to the fact that the higher the temperature, the faster water will evaporate. We've also got relative humidity to consider. The greater the relative humidity, the lower transpiration rate will be. And this is a direct effect of relative humidity on the gradient. So I'm going to add it as a secondary note here. High relative humidity weakens the gradient. In other words, air can only hold so much water, and relative humidity tells us how much water it is currently holding relative to the temperature. And so the closer you get to a relative humidity of 100%, the more saturated that air is. And if the air can't hold any more water, well, then no more water is going to be transpiring into the air. So relative humidity plays a big role. Transpiration rates are typically much higher in arid desert type conditions, let's say Arizona, for example, than they would be here in Florida, where we tend to have higher relative humidity levels. Leaf age plays a role. Okay. And it's not a direct higher or lower role, but we'll just say as a general rule, younger leaves have higher transpiration rates. And this is just because they're not as quick to react as older, more mature leaves. They're not as quick to open or close their stomata on an as needed basis. They also tend to have a much thinner wax coating on them when they're young because they haven't had time to build up a wax layer. And so they're just tender. They tend to be more prone to wilt because they tend to lose a lot more water than a mature leaf. And then we've also got a factor of leaf morphology, and this just refers to some features that many plants have on their leaves in an effort to reduce transpiration rates in hot conditions. For example, things like hairs, pits, etc., that slow transpiration rates. We'll come back to this morphology deal here in a second once we describe this final factor here on our list, and that is the factor of wind or air movement. The greater the air movement or wind, the higher the transpiration rate tends to be. This is due to its effect on what we call the boundary layer. The boundary layer is a layer of 100% relative humidity on the leaf surface. And let's take a look at a diagram of what we're talking about here. This depicts the interior of the leaf, and these are leaf cells with their green chloroplasts in them. We've got guard cells on either side of a stomatal opening, and these little aqua blue spheres represent water molecules. And if the air is very still, this allows these molecules to form a thick layer of heavy, humid air on the surface of the leaves. And the more still the air is, the thicker this boundary layer gets. This has a result of dramatically slowing the rate of transpiration, because although the evaporation rate is highly dependent on a lot of these conditions, the diffusion of these water molecules to air further away from the leaf is still a relatively slow process. But just like making iced tea or Kool-Aid, if we somehow stir up the air by a wind, let's say, it increases the rate at which these molecules diffuse outward. And so wind comes along and is blowing along here. It scrubs down the boundary layer. and so it makes the water move faster when it's windy. The boundary layer is much thicker when there's no wind. Well, then this water molecule here has a much more tortuous path to get out here to the drier air, and so it takes it much, much longer to diffuse through all these other water molecules and all the air molecules as well. So increased wind increases transpiration rates because it reduces this boundary layer barrier to the movement of the water molecules. And to wrap it up, let's go back to what we were talking about with leaf morphology. Many plants will have on the surfaces of their leaves numerous things like hairs, and we call that pubescence. They'll have layers of hair or fuzzy outcroppings from the leaf. Things like that, in effect, increase the boundary layer. And so the boundary layer in this plant's case, instead of being that thick, would always be pretty much that thick, which slows down the rate of transpiration. And so we tend to see these kinds of hairs and other appendages and morphological differences on leaves as an adaptation to hot, dry, more desert type conditions as a means of conserving moisture. And these hairs are oftentimes, in the case of many desert plants, silver in color, and that helps them reflect light, which also slows down the rate of transpiration.